to share with you what I think is wrong with our management in terms of flooding. Next slide, please. Would you believe me if I tell you that in 2023, we spent 27 billion pesos for flood control? Now, I'm actually lying because it's not 27 billion, it's 276 billion pesos spent for flood control in 2023. And yet, no, we see flooding almost everywhere as if the government is not doing anything. There are funds, but I believe that our approach to flooding in 2024, with the guidance of our president himself, we would see a more effective flood program. We are actually very rich in terms of water resources. Unfortunately, we see it as a disadvantage because it causes flooding. But let me tell you that our main asset as a country is actually our water. There's so much water that it causes flooding, but it's the same water that we need for our irrigation, for providing water to our communities, hydropower, aquaculture, ecotourism, and so on and so forth. So how come it is a disadvantage when it is actually an advantage of our country? Next slide, please. Next slide. Our rivers are pretty dynamic, and what I can tell you is that we should provide room for our rivers instead of constraining it. Next slide, please. Let me show you what we are doing with our rivers. All our rivers, because it overflows and causes flooding, our immediate response is to contain the water. Now, as you can see in this picture here, this is the Bislac River, or the Bislac River in Vintar, Ilocos Norte. And you can see on both sides, there are dikes. Now, each of those dikes cost around 500 million pesos, now, mind you. Now, what is wrong with this? No? Because the dikes tend to protect the communities and the farmlands on both sides. Let me tell you what is wrong with this. This is further upstream of the Bislac River, so we are very far from the ocean. What it does is that it constrains the river, the flow of the river. And the effect of that is that it increases the velocity. The speed of the water increases because instead of spreading to its natural areas called floodplains, we are now constraining it as if parang hose na pinisil mo. You constrain it. With the increase in velocity, it increases its erodibility. So it erodes a lot of sediments and brings all these sediments downstream. That is why we see our rivers downstream as color brown, very silted, because the scouring effect of our rivers has increased because we put all these dikes midstream and upstream. Next slide, please. I'll skip this, but this simply tells you that the river actually scours even more intensely when we put dikes. Next slide. Okay, so this is how our rivers look like today. That is actually a river in Cavite, and what you see are these huge walls on both sides. What it does, it cuts off the river from the rest of the river channel, which naturally is flooded during extreme rain events. Now that we have constrained it, I just told you two things. Number one, increase in velocity. Number two, more siltation. But the third one that I will tell you, and it is most important, is that where do you think that water will go if it doesn't spread out to its floodplains? The water does not disappear. What these do is actually put all that water even further downstream, causing even more flooding in the downstream communities of our rivers. So every time that we put dikes in the midstream area, there's more flooding that happens downstream. Don't be fooled that this is climate change, that the floods are more intense these days. It's not. It's the same, except that that water that was supposed to be spreading in the midstream and upstream portions of the rivers are now all completely brought downstream. Next slide, please. Here's Pampanga River in Laur, Nueva Ecija. So you can see the river over there. Now, that yellow line that you see is a dike that has been constructed. Just south of those dikes, that is the floodplain. Because of the dike, we have cut off completely that floodplain. And if you can just imagine, during the rainy season, that portion is also occupied by water. Now that there is a dike, all that water that's supposed to have spread out will now go further downstream, causing even more flooding. Next slide. So the problem is that when we put dikes, next slide please, when we put more dikes, and this is again Bislac River, what we do is cut off the floodplains. Next slide. So all those blue portions will no longer be occupied by water. Where do you think the water goes? It even flows further downstream. Next slide. So even more intense flooding happening because of the constraining of the river channel. Next slide. In the Pampanga River Basin, these are all the flood control projects that we have implemented this year alone, in 2023, roughly around 8 billion pesos worth of taxpayers' money to control flooding. But as you probably have heard, in July of this year, there was massive flooding that happened in Pampanga and Bulacan. So what is the effect, or what is the impact of all these infrastructure when it actually increases the flood potential of our rivers? Next slide. So ayoko naman puro sisi at mali, dapat merong kapalit na solusyon. What is our solution? Instead of trying to push out all that water as fast as we can into the ocean, I just mentioned to you earlier that water, this water, very same water that causes flooding, is our main asset. And therefore, what we should be doing during the rainy season is to impound them. I'll just give you one more statistic so that you will remember the whole lecture. there is a metric being measured, no, per country, and this is stored water per capita. How much water is stored during the rainy season for use during the dry season? For the Philippines, we are storing 63 cubic meters per person or per capita. Now let's compare that to our neighbors. Vietnam stores 113 cubic meters per person. Compare that to Malaysia, they store 700 cubic meters per person, and to Thailand, which is very robust in terms of agriculture and so on and so forth, 1,100 cubic meters. So what are we missing here? All our neighbors, they are impounding and storing water and utilizing this for hydropower and agriculture and so on and so forth, when our approach is to try to push this as fast as we can towards the ocean. So in 2024, together with the President, we are approaching flood management differently, starting with impoundment. Next slide. What we wish to do is to control flooding and impound water. No? As we impound these waters in these natural basins or catchments, we wish the local government units to actually not only look at this as a flood control project, but as a means of livelihood, because you will now have these lakes and reservoirs that you can use for aquaculture and for irrigating your farms and so on and so forth. Now, I know it is not a local project when we do flood control. No, these are all national projects, but as local chief executives, you have a say of what types of infrastructure are actually constructed in your jurisdiction. This is what I propose. This is what Malacanang is pushing for, and we hope that LGUs will look at this as an alternative measure or infrastructure towards flood control. This is flood control plus impoundment of water for use for other beneficial purposes. I hope I shared with you in this 9 minutes. Maraming salamat po.
Lahat po ng newsflash video ay makikita sa aking newsflash playlist. Sa mga gusto naman po ng mga biblical topics, punta po kayo sa aking channel na Mahaphir TV. Para sa mga gustong mag-order ng Fermax Firmang and Lifting Cream and Immune System Booster, contact Mr. Dante Maravillas on Facebook. Cell phone number 090865537757.